Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Usually when we dig into history, we're focusing on grand strategies, sweeping empires, and those profound world-altering battles. But today we are looking at the exact opposite. We're diving into the blunders, the bizarre, and the downright absurd. I'm talking about history's most ridiculous and accidental conflicts. This explainer is totally dedicated to those times when human history completely went off the rails over things like a misplaced animal or just sheer unbelievable forgetfulness. So get ready, because the facts we're looking at today are literally going to leave you speechless. So let's jump right in. What if I told you that the longest war in recorded human history lasted for over 3 centuries, and yet nobody died, not a single person? No epic battles, no sieges, no blockades. Actually, for almost the entirety of this conflict, the people involved didn't even realize they were at war at all. It is the ultimate historical paradox, right? A massive, century-spanning war where absolutely nothing happened. And that brings us to the 335-year war. That number right there, that represents exactly how long this conflict dragged on. This was a war between the Netherlands and a tiny archipelago off the southwestern tip of Great Britain called the Isles of Scilly. The whole thing officially started way back in 1651 during the English Civil War. Basically, the Dutch Navy was pretty upset over losses caused by royalist privateers based on those islands, so they officially declared war. But, well, shortly after that, the royalists surrendered to the parliamentarians, so the Dutch just packed up their ships and went home. But here is the absolute kicker. They completely forgot to sign a peace treaty. They just went home, went about their business, and the paperwork was entirely forgotten. So for 335 years, the Netherlands and this tiny collection of islands were legally in a state of war. It wasn't until 1986 that a local historian from the Isles of Scilly actually wrote to the Dutch embassy in London, basically asking, hey, are we still technically at war? The embassy checked their archives, realized the horrifying bureaucratic truth, and a Dutch ambassador was quickly rushed over to finally sign a peace treaty. 335 years, 0 shots fired, 0 casualties, all because of forgotten paperwork. Just incredible. The 38-minute war, a blink and you miss it conflict. Okay, so we just looked at a war that dragged on for 3.5 centuries because of a clerical error. Now let's flip to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. A conflict so short you literally could have missed the entire thing on your lunch break. 38 minutes. That is the entire duration of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which is officially recorded as the shortest war in history. Back in 1896, the British Empire had a very firm grip on the eastern seaboard of Africa. They had this strict rule that any new sultan in Zanzibar needed the British seal of approval before taking the throne. Well, the pro-British sultan mysteriously died, and his cousin seized power. He essentially told the British Empire to just take a hike. The British, as you might expect from a global superpower at the time, did not take this well at all. They issued a very simple ultimatum: step down or else. At 9 a.m. sharp, that British ultimatum expired. The new sultan, he thought it was a bluff. Spoiler alert, it was not. At exactly 9:02 a.m., a fleet of heavily armed British Navy gunships, which were conveniently pointed directly at the sultan's wooden palace, opened fire. The destruction was absolute. By 9:40 a.m., just 38 minutes later, the guns fell silent. The palace was reduced to total rubble, the sultan had fled to a nearby German consulate, and the war was entirely over. But notice the staggering contrast in casualties here. In those 38 minutes, 500 palace defenders perished, and the British casualties? Exactly 1 injured sailor. It's just a staggering display of asymmetrical power, all packed into less time than it takes to watch a sitcom episode. Wars over food and animals. When livestock and soup trigger international incidents. All right, we're pivoting to what might be my absolute favorite category: wars sparked by the most mundane things you could possibly imagine. Picture this matchup for a second. On one side, we have the Australian military in 1932, fully equipped with heavy machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition. On the other side, we have a flock of emus. Yes, you heard that right. This was the Great Emu War of Western Australia. Farmers were practically begging the government for help because massive flocks of native emus were completely destroying their wheat crops. The government's brilliant solution? Send in the military. It sounds like an incredibly easy victory for the soldiers, right? Well, not exactly. These large birds just scattered, regrouped, and completely outmaneuvered the armed forces at every turn. Honestly, this quote perfectly sums up the entire ordeal. After a month of utter humiliation, burning through ammunition with barely a single thing to show for it, the military commanders literally just gave up and went home. The soldiers retreated. The emus held their ground. The birds legitimately emerged victorious against a modern, fully armed military. But hey, Australia isn't the only one finding themselves in bizarre standoffs. Let's look at this one. The United States versus the British Empire, two absolute global heavyweights. In 1859, tensions boiled over regarding the boundary of the San Juan Islands. Now, what do you think sparked this massive international military standoff involving warships and heavily armed troops? Was it gold, oil, strategic territory? Nope, it was a pig. Specifically, a British-owned pig wandered onto an American farmer's land and ate his potatoes. The farmer shot the pig, the British authorities threatened to arrest the farmer, the U.S. military stepped in to protect him, and suddenly, two sprawling empires were on the brink of all-out war over a potato-stealing swine. He just can't make this stuff up. Fortunately, cooler heads eventually prevailed in the pig war, and the only casualty of the entire international standoff was exactly one pig. But honestly, even one pig sounds kind of high compared to the Kettle War of 1784 between the Holy Roman Empire and the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. So the Holy Roman Emperor sent a ship down the river just to test a Dutch blockade. The Dutch fired a single warning shot. Just one. And that single shot hit and completely destroyed a soup kettle sitting on the deck of the Roman ship. The ship immediately surrendered. The only casualty in that entire war? One pot of soup. Armies defeating themselves, the ultimate friendly fire incident. Okay, the Battle of Caransebes in 1788 sounds like it belongs in a comedy sketch, but it was tragically very real. It started simply enough. The Austrian army, who were out scouting for the Ottoman forces, ends up purchasing a massive amount of schnapps from some local merchants. From there, things go downhill fast. Different factions of the Austrian army bump into each other in the dark, and a drunken argument breaks out over who actually gets to drink the schnapps. In all the chaos, the confusion, and the pitch-black darkness, someone fires a shot. Panic instantly spreads. The soldiers actually begin to hallucinate and start shouting that the Ottomans are attacking. What follows is an absolute disaster. The various wings of the Austrian army, who spoke different languages and were utterly confused, begin engaging in a fierce, full-scale battle entirely against themselves. By the time the sun came up and they realized the Ottoman army was nowhere even close to the area, a massive number of Austrian soldiers had been killed or wounded by their own comrades. The absurdity of history, bureaucracy, blunders, and the human condition. So when we piece all this together, the 335 years of totally forgotten peace between the Dutch and the Isles of Scilly, the 38-minute destruction of a palace, the victorious emus, the martyred pig, the surrendered soup kettle, and that disastrously drunken Austrian self-sabotage, we see a really fascinating pattern emerge. History isn't just this neat, orderly march of deliberate, calculated progress. I mean, if massive international incidents can hinge on a farmer's potatoes, and a state of war can exist for over 3 centuries without a single casualty, simply because some clerk forgot to file the paperwork, what does that actually say about human conflict? It tells us that underneath all the grand titles and the imposing, heavily armed militaries, history is ultimately driven by deeply flawed, highly unpredictable human beings. Bureaucracy fails, wild miscommunications happen, and sometimes the birds just win. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always double-check your paperwork.